Good afternoon, everyone, and it's me again, sorry for that, but welcome to our keynote lecture. I just want to remind you about our hashtags. I don't tweet, but I think people have been tweeting already, which is great. And do share your memories with our POLEV. Is that what you call it, Russell? Poll everywhere, thank you. About your favourite languages memories, so that we can just share them, as the conference is about sharing languages and languages memories. I hope you've enjoyed the first session. It was a wonderful time in the multi-literacy session just now. I'm here to introduce Professor Juan Luis Suarez, who's going to give our keynote lecture, The Language of Peace in Colombia. You'll have read the abstract, so I'm not going to say too much about that. And I have here a list of, the usual things to say about the speaker. So I'm going to read that in a second. But Juan Luis was introduced to the project through Paul Spence, who's running our digital mediation strand, and with whom we've worked for a long time. And last year I went to meet Juan Luis in London, Ontario, and we had a conversation, and that's what's really inspired us to invite you, Juan Luis, because it was a wonderful conversation about the things that preoccupy us in language acts and world making, which I repeat is the work that languages do in the world. It was about the research that we do. It was about the teaching that we do, how we can transform teaching. And Juan Luis talked to me about different teaching methods that he uses at Western, which are really exciting and attract many, many, many students to languages and humanities. So these are the types of links and connections that we want to make. So Juan Luis Suarez is a professor of digital humanities and computer science at Western University, and he also directs the Cultureplex Lab. You have a link in the website to the Cultureplex Lab. If you haven't looked at it yet, go there and look, because it is a really wonderful centre for digital research, an online centre for digital research that really shows the types of connections you can make using digital humanities as a research tool and as a mode to develop research. And as a director of Cultureplex Lab, Juan Luis has supervised a lot of different interdisciplinary projects and theses in the areas of digital humanities and human-centred analytics. The topic of the keynote lecture, Language of Peace in Colombia, I don't need to say anything about that. Most of you will know about recent history of peace and conflict in Colombia, and Juan Luis will say more about that. But I think it's really perfect for us to be listening to this now and to be thinking about the ways we use digital humanities research. Some of you might not know what that is, but I hope you'll get a good sense of that, to enliven the way that we think through languages and in languages, and how we think globally, and how we really begin to understand how we construct the languages around us. And this here, the language of peace, is obviously one of the most important, perhaps. And in Colombia, with such a history of violence and suffering, it's such an important part of their contemporary history. So I'm not going to say any more. I'm going to welcome Juan Luis Suarez. The way we're going to do this is that Juan Luis is going to give his lecture. Paul Spence, as I said, is one of our researchers on language acts and world making and leads up the digital mediation strand, is going to give a short response, and then we will open to conversation. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for being with us, Juan Luis.
You know the trick.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming out to the lecture, and thank you to the organizers for having me here, talking about a research project that I have been working on for the last 2.5 years, more or less, and that is starting to take shape as we speak. I'm going to start giving you some context in case you don't know the details of Colombia's recent history and the peace process. And then I'll go into the main theoretical and practical questions that are leading the project and how we are trying to solve some of them. So the project started out of my ignorance about what war meant. And I remember that quite some time ago I approached a colleague from the Department of History who specializes in the history of war. And she told me basically that we don't know what war means beyond the politically acceptable definition in international law that has to do with not having X number of casualties in a conflict between two nations for a period of time. So it's a very quantitative approach to what war means. That implies numbers, implies how many people die or not, and especially has to do with war being defined only when the protagonists are two nations. So that means that many other kinds of conflicts are not well represented in this definition. So I started doing some research, and at some point I also realized that they didn't know what peace meant. And that feeling of frustration with my ignorance got accentuated when I realized at some point during the project that the signing of the peace agreement in 2016 in Colombia wouldn't necessarily mean that the country would enter into a state of peace. So the question is, what kind of states would you enter into after signing a peace agreement, and how many different states can a society live in between getting to something closer to what I normally associate with peace, which is my life in Spain or in England, and I live in Bristol or in Canada for the last over 20 years. I get from the dictionary this definition about peace being a state of period in which there is no war or a war has ended. And this is really important because in political terms and in terms of international law, the conflict in Colombia has never been defined as a war. It's not a war, as we will see, and that's very important. It's defined as a conflict, or as an internal conflict, or as an armed internal conflict. And that's because of the political repercussions that accepting that there is an internal war, a civil war, have in the rules of engagement of the states and the parties, and also in the capacity for foreign powers or multilateral institutions to intervene in a given country or context. After 4.5 years of negotiations in Havana on 26th of September of 2016, the main secretary of the FARC, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, EP, Ejército del Pueblo, People's Army, Timochenko on the right-hand side, and the President of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, signed an agreement with the support, as you can see, of all the international community back then. An international community that it's, if you compare that picture with the picture of the equivalents today, is completely different in terms of who is the new UN Secretary General, President of Cuba, our emeritus king in Spain, and the representative from the Obama government, which was very supportive of the peace process. I think that the only one left there, of course, the president of Peru is almost going to jail, as all the presidents of Peru are going to jail or are already in jail for the last, I don't know, 100 years. And the president of Mexico is getting out in a couple of months. And the president of Colombia is also getting out in a month. So it's like in 2 years everything changed and the context in international terms, and also in terms of Colombian political setting also changed. This is very important because the FARC had been fighting the state and vice versa for over 50 years. There have been over 300,000 dead, millions of people displaced, and the number of victims related to all types of crimes. It's just amazing how a country and a society can live in such a state for such a long period of time. So I was finishing my sabbatical period in Bogota, and right before they signed this agreement. I left Bogota at the beginning of September, and I was totally convinced, as most of the media, because they had a lot of support from the main media, that the agreement would be supported by the people. So the president decided, although he had constitutional powers to just make the agreement into law, he decided to put it to the people, and he called for a plebiscite to vote favor or against the agreement. And surprisingly, on the 2nd of October of 2016, most people decided that they didn't want peace with the FARC. A little over 50 people of the population who voted, which wasn't much, because there was almost 63% of abstention, decided not to vote. So that provoked a sort of a cataclysm in international chancelleries, but in internal terms too. And the government and the negotiators decided to negotiate with the no side, headed by former President Uribe, and most of the neo-Christian, of the evangelical Christians in churches in Colombia. And they changed much of the agreement, going back with the FARC to negotiate in Havana for almost 2 months, a little short than 2 months. And that came into law as what it's called the final agreement, or what I call the second final agreement, in which, according to the main negotiator for the government, 80% of the things that the no side wanted to include it in the agreement were included. Okay? The next chapter of this process will be play out on Sunday, this coming Sunday, which is the date of the second round of the presidential election. A presidential election that has been mostly not about the peace process, although you would think that this would be the main thing given the polarization of the country, but about many other things, and which will be fought between Iván Duque, a technocrat that is running on behalf of President Uribe, opposed to the peace agreement, and Gustavo Petro, former mayor of Bogota, left-leaning, very radical according to many people, who has been demonized as the possible maker of a second Venezuela in Colombia. So complete polarization, and if Iván Duque wins, which is the most likely outcome, one of the things that they have been saying throughout the campaign is that he will tear apart the agreement completely, and he will try to renegotiate it. Not sure exactly who he's going to renegotiate it with, because the FARC has already become a political party, and they have, as per the agreement, representation in the next parliament. So it's very curious how all these things play out. So we started studying language as a result of my ignorance about what war and peace wasn't in the Colombian context, but also linked to a project initiated by the central bank, the Banco de la República, which is the main cultural institution in the country as well. Has the main network of libraries, the Botero Museum, the Gold Museum, and plays a very important role in giving some structure and continuity to the presence of the state in the life of the citizens across all the provinces. So they started this project, La Paz se toma la palabra, and one of the main ideas they have is that, as stupid as it may sound, you will see now that it's not such, that we need words to name peace. And the question is what those words are and why are they important. Again, it's very evident. You sign an agreement, you have peace. We live in the UK or we live in Canada, and peace is the default state of things, but in most of the world it's not. And one of the main problems that a society or a person have in order to be able to live in peace is to be able to know what peace means, to be able to name it, to imagine it. And I think that's the main thing about all this. So we started a project in which we assume some of the questions of the theory of language by Donald Davidson, in which he says that you, or an interpreter, is able to make sense of the words of a person or a group of persons if you are able to detect patterns in the linguistic behavior of that person or of that community. So the question for me was, can we infer the linguistic behavior of Colombians when they are talking about peace? What is it that they are talking about when they are talking about peace? And as part of the methodology, we have used tools, digital tools, to detect patterns in terms of natural language processing, some machine learning, artificial intelligence, that we have combined with what it's called, for us, close reading. So a mix of what Moretti would call distant reading, or Simon Didio would call coarse graining analysis of a social reality. But also combined with very close reading of a specific text that I will show in a minute. The question with the language of peace in Colombia and the community that is creating the utterances of that language, of those meanings of peace, have to do not only with politicians and the agreement, although I will focus on that today, but with as many sectors of society as possible. So in our partnership with the central bank, with the Banco de la República, we were able to collect around 1,000 cards written out by children, moms, women, men, going to different cultural activities, in which, in this case, for instance, they would write about a specific event of peace in their lives. Okay, so they would ask, can you write a few words, a few sentences about a moment in your life that was especially peaceful or related to peace? And this is one of them, in which a girl talks about the problems with her brother, and how they reconcile, and how that's for her an important event of peace in her life. We have another one in which a father or a father figure starts kicking a dog, and the boy faces up this father figure and tells him not to hit the dog, and they have this confrontation. This is very interesting, because when we did all the analysis of all these cards and some similar cards from another activity, we realized that what people were talking about were basically these three semantic, let's call it islands or domains. We're talking about other people, basically, and in that category they were talking especially about their families, and they were talking about the space, and a space that it's very close in physical terms to your own physical reality. So people, for instance, in a village near Medellin, we're not talking about the space in Bogota or the space in another part of the country. They're talking about their own house, their home, their street, the school, things that or places that they live in daily. This very small world, it's very important, because when you compare the semantic domains that they use to refer to peace in their daily lives, completely differs from the legal and political text and the agreements that politicians, for different reasons and good reasons, decided to use when they are talking about peace. And at some point we were wondering whether or not this problem about the semantic gap between different social groups have to do with the problems they have to get to a common ground in terms of what is it that we mean by peace, to living in a peaceful country. We also analyzed this text, which is a very long text, thank God that we have digital tools, which it's called Contribution to the Understanding of the Armed Conflict in Colombia, Historical Commission of the Conflict and its Victims. And this is a book commissioned by the negotiating teams. Both the FARC and the government decided that they need, before discussing the section on victims in the peace agreement in Havana, that they needed to have a volume with most perspectives about why the conflict started, why it had lasted so long, and how this affected the victims. We analyzed this, and to tell you the truth, the historians and political scientists don't devote nothing to the victims, and they engage in different ideological interpretations, Marxist and less Marxist, and more capitalist or more from the right, about why the conflict came about and why it was fair or not to keep the conflict going for such a long time. So a completely different domain. People in the family, children, women talking about something, our colleagues from the universities talking about what we talk about, which is other authors and other theories and all those things, and people in Twitter, after an analysis of 3,600,000 tweets that we collected throughout 2016, they were talking about something different from the other two social groups. In many cases, through this type of tags that become trending topics very fast, and they also disappear in many cases very fast. But like in most tagging system, have very little semantic content because they are related to not too many other nodes of semantic meaning. So they become like islands that appear and disappear very fast. They catch the attention. They are used sort of to bring the community together, and by community I mean people who use Twitter to get into their discussions, and they disappear, and another one becomes the trending topic and the hook to bring the community together very fast. So what we realized after doing this pre-analysis of different types of documents and social groups is that people were talking about different things. So I was happy that it wasn't only me that didn't know what peace meant, but when people in Colombia were talking about peace, they were meaning completely different things depending on the context and who were the persons or the groups talking. If you get to another type of text, to the final agreement between the FARC and the government, you have, for instance, this definition about the conflict and what a victim is and what peace is. And here you have basically the three main images or metaphors that the agreement uses to refer to peace in a very poor sense. And I say very poor sense because the agreement, and I have to say that in political terms, I'm in favor of the agreement. I think it was needed in this format or in a different format. Has a very good institutional architecture. It's very well thought out and it was very well negotiated. But in semantic terms, in terms of the care for the meaning of the words, the basic definitions that should be the pillars of such an agreement, especially because it's going to be used to build the country in the next few years, is not as good as, in my opinion, should be in order to avoid some of the political and legal problems that will come up later. So, for instance, I will focus on victims later on, but if you see this definition of victims, basically what they have is a list of social groups. And as nice as that is in terms of inclusion, that's not a legal definition, and you cannot play with this, especially when the list is not ending ever. It's like there will be always more victims. And you say, okay, but if we're going to be a peaceful country at some point, at least this type of victims shouldn't be reappearing anymore, or we are not solving the problems that we say that we will solve. Basically, the agreement uses three main tools to refer to peace. First is that, especially in all the media releases, which is a very important tool that they use throughout the 4 years of negotiation, they almost 90% of the times, both parties refer or they talk to the public as we. They don't say the government and the FARC like two separate entities. And I think that was very important to bring into the minds and the imagination of Colombians that they were trying to solve the problem between the two parties. And they were talking just as the we of the Colombians, of all Colombians. Then they always talk about peace as stable and long-lasting. What does it mean? It's not said, although I think probably the intention of the negotiators was that they needed to solve some of the problems that in structural terms had created the conflict, and they will have to create the institutions and the structure, especially the presence of the state everywhere in the country, that have, in the first place, provoked the conflict like 55 years ago. And the third reference that it's repeated time and time again is the metaphor of building. That definition that you have there, that we must build a stable and lasting peace, is repeated many, many times. So peace for the negotiators is built. And as much as I have been trying to study metaphors of building, I haven't found many in other types of literature that would help me understand what is it that you mean by building peace. I understand in political terms what they are trying to do, because they are trying to create a new legal architecture. But in terms of normal people, in terms even of the conflict that you're going to have in the future and solved by legal and political means, what's building peace? It sounds very, very nice, but I'm not able to wrap my head around that. This agreement was very important because from the very beginning, Sergio Jaramillo and the government of Sergio Jaramillo was the High Commissioner for Peace with the government of Santos, and along with Humberto de la Calle, the two main architects of the peace process and how they would negotiate with the FARC and everything, it was very clear about the agreement being about the victims. And I think that was very intelligent, and I think that he really thought that would be the case, because the victims could become one of those points in which all parties would agree. It's not about you, it's not about me, it's not about your ideas, it's not about their ideas, about people who have suffered, and we have to sort of cure that if we want to cure society and become something else. So the agreement and the negotiation was described as the moment of the victims and the moments of peace in several occasions. This has a background, which is the law 1448 from 2011, passed by Congress and enacted today, in which there is a very clear definition of what a victim is in legal terms, in order to receive reparation and to be recognized as a victim. And reparation and recognition are two very important processes, parts in any process of transitional justice. So the definition was very important, and as you can see, that the conflict started 54 years ago now. The definition of a victim in legal terms is limited to 1995 onwards, nothing going back into the past. Just some more context, the negotiation started with this general agreement, which was signed in Oslo, and then the negotiating parties went into Havana, as I said, for 4.5 years, and they were supposed to discuss all these issues with a rule established by the government, which was very important, that said that nothing is agreed upon until everything is agreed upon. So you have to follow a chronological order in the negotiation. They started with rural development policy, which was one of the traditional problems in Colombia, how the land is shared or not, and they would agree on that, in principle, because if they didn't agree on all other issues, that part of the agreement was off the table too. And that was to make sure that everybody was reasonable in negotiating the other points going forward. And that the solution had to come as a holistic solution for the country, otherwise it wouldn't solve the original problems that had created the conflict. You see that victims are point number 5 here, I think it is. And I'll go back to that, why victims are there as one of the main issues in the negotiating process, in the agenda, and how that came about in quote-unquote real terms. So we went to all the negotiating, all the documents published by what is called the negotiating table, the Mesa de Conversaciones in Havana. It was very nice in terms of transparency, because they published, and it's still up in a website of the High Commissioner for Peace, all the documents that they had been using and that were not classified. So all the media releases, or the historical commission, which is the book that I just showed you, all the general documents, partial agreements, everything is published and is available. There are only two types of documents which have not been published. One is the minutes of the negotiations, because it's classified. I guess that at some point they will release that when we are old or dead in 50 years. And the other thing is, and this was also very important, or very innovative in terms of participatory politics in general in the world, is that they opened up a process for people to contribute. So both through paper and through an online tool. You were a Colombian, you could send the negotiating parties whatever you wanted, saying, okay, I want the negotiating parties to discuss the state of my house, or my divorce, or whatever you wanted. And some people wrote things like that, or they just sent a book through email and all those things. A couple of interesting things. In terms of the participatory process, the citizen would receive an email back once both parties had opened the email in the electronic tool, not in the paper tool. And apparently, the citizens didn't receive many emails because one of the parties didn't read any of the contributions from the citizens. And you can imagine which party was that. I would say if it was the People's Army or the People's Government. We can talk about that. It was a little frustrating in terms of having such an innovative tool to foster political participation and then not having any feedback. We were about to sign an agreement in my lab with the High Commissioner for Peace a few months ago before the electoral process started to have all that database and get it analyzed with the idea of comparing in semantic terms what is it that the citizens have proposed and what is it that the politicians were able to achieve in the final agreement. And I hope that we'll be able to access that database at some point. I think it would be very interesting, especially leading into new negotiations as they are now with the ELN, the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, and the other armies that are still going on in Colombia. So basically we analyze all these documents using basically not only, but basically natural language processing, some artificial intelligence. We read some of them and we get into some details also. We started focusing on the victims because the victims, as we will say in a moment, will be a key part of the architecture of the language of peace. As I said, this is supposed to be the victims' moment. The core of the agreement, according to the parties, is to redress for victims. And they repeat this time and time again. The victims are also important because in any transitional justice process in the world, Rwanda, even the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Indigenous People in Canada, the victims are supposed to be at the center. You are supposed to be solving the problems that the situation created for those victims. But as historians and political scientists have noticed, there is no transitional justice process in which parties don't say that they are not negotiating on behalf of the victims. So that leads to many people to think that they are just instrumentalized. They are used by the parties, and they are pushed aside as soon as they solve, in linguistic terms and in legal terms, some of the problems. But they are not really the solution that they are looking for. So we analyzed all those documents, and we came, among many other things, with count frequency of words. And these are the words that in the 137 documents published over the 4.5 years came the most often. Agreement, national conflict, government, FARC, politics, Colombia, peace. Are victims there somewhere? Victims occupy the 16th position when you put all documents together with 833 appearances. so around 0.14% of the whole language expressed by the parties in these 4 years in Havana. Curiously, victims appear mainly in 2 moments during the negotiations. One is around 2015, when they are negotiating the 5th point that I showed at the beginning in the general agenda. They are negotiating about victims. And at the end, the last spike you see there is a spike of the final text of the agreement. So you have to think that any part that is discussed and agreed upon before gets incorporated into the final agreement. So that's why there is that repetition over there. The interesting thing, and I'll go back there into a moment, is that when you count just the final agreement, the percentage of occupied by victims in the total language goes up a little bit, 3.3%, but it still raises the question whether or not the victims were the central issue for the parties. And even in terms of the projects related to this or other transitional justice processes, is what can you say that it's enough in order to validate a theme as an important part of a document or a set of documents? Is 3%, is 5%, is where they appear, how they appear? Is there any connection between frequency and the imaginary and the language that a community is developing? And I think that there is some connection. When do they talk about the victims? They talk about the victims when they talk about the conflict. And you wonder why? Why is that? Why is it that there is a correlation between appearances of victims and appearances of conflicts? Initially, what they say is that they aim, or one aims at drafting of content that will satisfy the claims of those who have been affected by the long conflict. The long conflict, as I said, is the way the negotiating parties refer to what one of the most important intellectuals in Colombia has called a postmodern civil war, a completely asymmetric, in which there are many different parties and elements playing with different types of weapons, and in which the population is subject to violence, and it's within the country, between the state or part of the state and many different organizations. As I said, they are talking about the conflict, and they need to define the conflict, because when you are talking about the conflict, either in terms of the historical roots of the war in Colombia, or you are talking about, so I'll say in a minute, I'll stay here. In terms of defining the future, what you are also doing is creating the legal mechanisms that will solve some of the problems, what is normally called the special justice for peace, and what is called in proper terms the transitional justice. And transitional justice works in most conflicts in the world in such a way so that I'm a perpetrator and I don't want to be submitted to the normal courts. So I'll get into this type of special justice. And the agreement is that I will have lesser punishment or no punishment at all, as long as I say the truth. Okay, going back to language. I will say what I did to you in exchange for not being punished, or not being punished as I would be punished if a normal judge takes me and say, hey, you have killed 250 people. You're going to be in jail forever. So one of the reasons as to why victims and conflict always appear together is because, as I will say at the end, victims are needed for the perpetrators to get into the judicial system, into this special judicial system. And that can be preposterous and be morally enraging, but at the same time is part of why these processes are so important. The process of transitional justice put at the same level, in moral and legal terms, the victims and the perpetrators. And that's necessary, because that's what we do here. That's what we do in democracy and in systems ruled by law, in which we consider everyone, even people who have committed atrocious crimes, citizens, subject to the weight of law. If you go back from that definition, you start defining and describing the other as an animal, as less than human, as the enemy. And then you are in something which is worse than war. War, at least, is regulated by international law. There are rules of engagement. There are things that you can do and you can't do. If you go away from this, as bad as it sounds, you go into the conflict again. So you kill people not only because of economic interest, because at some point you define them as something less than you. They are not humans. They are animals. They have been killing people. They have been doing what it's called the false positives, in which the government would kill people, homeless people, and they would dress them as guerrilla to count more successes. Or you are part of the guerrilla and you have killed and raped and do all the things that they have been doing for 50 years. And you go back into that cycle of what kind of language you use in personal terms and what kind of language you use in institutional terms. Completely define who you will become as a society and as a person. You see this, that when they are talking about victims, they are talking about conflict in this context because of the co-appearances of the collocations of words. When you have when you have sentences containing conflict, the most words that you have are victims, reparation, which is a legal terms, and rights, recurrence, persons, human rights, etc. And the same thing happened the other way around. You are defining the victims, and you're talking about the legal structure that you are building to solve part of this problem in terms of transitional justice. Now, the next problem that they have with language is that they go from the definition they have in the law of 2011 to defining victims very loosely as people affected by the long conflict to a definition which is, I have to say again, very much influenced by us, by academics, from all different types of theoretical backgrounds. Feminism, post-colonialism, communitarianism, people from more liberal traditions, and all of them somehow get their way into this definition. One of the most important things that they did is, during the negotiating process, is the audiences with all kinds of social groups and all kinds of victims. And each of them wanted their own definition or case to be taken into account as part of this definition of victims. But as a result, when you are building this system of justice for peace, you go from these very legally bounded definitions by the International Criminal Court, and you have natural persons or organizations or cultural groups, they are also considered victims, to this definition, which is completely open. The armed conflict that has multiple causes, again, the armed conflict has caused the people unparalleled suffering and harm in our history. There are millions of Colombians, and in Spanish they put it in both masculine and feminine, so that the feminist perspective is taken into account, because most of the theory says that you are a victim, but if you are a victim and a woman, you are double victim because of your condition, and the possibilities of getting out of that situation is much worse because of physical, economic, land-related reasons. But then they talk about victims of forced displacement. There are some 100,000 deaths, scores of thousands of disappeared people of all types, and a wide array of collective groups and populations affected across the territory, including communities of peasants, indigenous, Afro-Colombian, black, palenqueras, raizales, Rom, political parties, social movements, and unions, guilds, among others. Not to mention other less visible but not less painful forms of victimization, such as sexual violence, psychological consequences, or the simple coexistence with fear. And I don't think that anyone will disagree with all these groups and people being victims. The question is this a manageable definition in a legal process, in a legal system? In terms of building a new society out of it, can you build a new society if the definition of victims is never closed? There will always be possibly more victims in this process. As said, the victims are not only victims, they are also actors with many identities and roles and resources, and that's why they include gender, they include both individuals and communities, they include in that definition the typology of damages, that's why they say death and displace and all that, and different definitions of personhood and identity. That has led to an anthropologist who I think is doing his PhD here in London, somewhere, and you will have many opinions about this, to write an article about the land as a victim in the peace process. And that, which probably will be totally acceptable by indigenous people, at least in my short knowledge in Canada, I don't know what the role that definition of land as also a victim will play along women and raizales and Afro-Colombianos and palenqueros and this and that and the other. I mean, when do you stop that definition? When do you close it down in order to make it effective and applicable? So in a sense, what this lack of rigor in the definition is creating is a constant separation from the victims to the core of the society, of that core to which you want to make bigger. So you are not closing the gap, you are keeping the gap in that definition of victims because you create an open-ended definition. It's based in many cases about all types of identities that we use in our postmodern world. It's totally fluid, you don't know when it's gonna close. It doesn't deal with the future or deals in a very open way. You can have new victims in the future. It's a list, which as Umberto Eco would say in his book of list, in many cases is the most ambiguous and inaccurate way of defining any reality, and doesn't leave any space for common encounters between different types of victims and non-victims in the future of Colombia. So some conclusions before we launch into the discussion. Despite the strong philosophical and doctrinal intent on the part of the signatories, the victims are made present into the process and into the final agreement only in the margins. Only in the margins, and especially in the sections on truth and reparations of the special justice peace section. Even in the section of non-recurrence, which is what type of tools will the state implement so that the situation doesn't repeat itself, the victims have already disappeared, mostly. Victims always appear, as I said, along the conflict. So being able to describe in historical and political and legal terms what has happened to Colombia is not possible without the victims, but at the same time the victims are sort of instrumentalized in order to recover the perpetrators and make them morally, I wouldn't say compatible, but at least to the bar of all citizens. For the victims to exist both as mentioned entities and subject of civil rights, it was previously necessary to explicitly redefine the conflict as an armed conflict. This redefinition lasted little. It was used by the government before the negotiations, by some of the historians, and a few times in the joint agreement of victims. As most of the time, the documents by the table refer to the situation simply as the conflict, whatever that means, and that is still the most common word used these days. As I said, the linguistic and civic existence of victims also requires establishing a system of justice that acknowledges the criminals are morally equal in terms of participating in the legal system that we accept as fair and democratic and subject to the doctrine of human rights that most of us accept. And the last question has to do with something that really has shocked me in the last few weeks, which has been several reviews of this work in which the reviewers ask this question: does language even matter? And then I got like, and then they thought like, why and how? And then I thought that I was missing something. Because, I mean, these are texts that you're signing as legal documents to build a country. And a social scientist asked, does language matter? And at some point I realized, have we gone back so far in the last 10 years so that we don't even talk about post-truth? We just question ourselves whether or not in our society, in any society, in the social fabric of humankind, language has a role to play, and you have to explain which role. And I'm going to leave it here because I don't have the answers to this. I don't know if it's me or we have gone into some kind of Freudian regression to another time of humankind, of pre-humankind. But these are the questions that people are asking. Does language matter? In this case, to humans who have been killing each other for 50 years. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis, for a very engaging presentation. Thank you very much for a very engaging presentation. I wanted to ask you, first of all, a little bit more about the sources for your study. So you talked about the documents published by the negotiating table. I wanted to ask you if you have, I wasn't clear if you were comparing paper with digital or if you're just focusing on digital. And I also wanted to know whether you've had a chance to compare to other documents produced by other sectors within the society. So obviously the negotiating table is dealing with the people that are part of the signatories to the agreement, but there are other parts of society. Did you have a chance to kind of do comparisons of that type?
Yeah, the documents we used for this particular section of the project were all PDFs as they are published in the website of the negotiations still today. So we basically downloaded them, converted into TXT, and analyzed them. And they are all, as I said, the different types are the media releases, the partial agreements, some documents on the process and how they were negotiating. The book was published as a PDF there, the book by the historians, although it's a completely different type of document, and then the final agreement. And we have done some comparisons with some of the other documents that I show, the ones written by moms and children, and the Twitter section that we did at the same time that they were negotiating the last part of the agreement, the last year. And those, in the first case, you have seen the types of document that we had, so we have to transcribe them from whatever the people had written down. And in the case of Twitter, everything is digitized, so we basically use the API, the streaming API.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and in terms of your research history, you did research on Spanish Golden Age with preliminares. So this is quite a departure from some of your earlier research. How did you have to change your methods? How was that different to your earlier experience of using cultural and social analytics?
I wrote my thesis in McGill about Calderón de la Barca, who is a Spanish playwright from the 17th century. And I was very ambitious as any PhD student who is, if you're not a little silly, what? The problem with Calderón is that he wrote 80 plays and 120 religious plays, autosacramentales. So I read all of them. That's what I claim in the introduction of the thesis. And that's a lot of plays. A lot of plays. So in terms of and of course I didn't have any of these tools. I read them like reading them. But when you are studying that, and I think that happens with any period or any author, you try to study a genre, just trying to connect it to some of the more traditional research that we do. At some point, you rely on your memory, or your notes. And even if you do your notes, at some point you don't remember your notes. So you have certain obstacles there when you want to go very wide in any field. So in that respect, this project is very similar. So it was 137 documents. It's fewer words than Calderon's plays. But from the very beginning, because I have already been doing some of this work, I think that having a combined method would be the most appropriate. And I decided that because the first thing that we do when we try to analyze by computer methods any text or group of text is to extract the frequency. And we do that because normally you come to a text of a problem with your ideas and you confirm, like in Twitter, what you want to see. You say, this text is about this. I knew it. I have read it. And of course, because you are only looking for those things, you don't realize about that. So what we try to do is, okay, what are the texts talking about? So give me the 100 or 200 most used words and when they appear. And from there, we try to go into more detail using more cross-reading, either semantic analysis with computer tools or by just reading them naturally.
Mm-hmm. So this morning we talked in one of the sessions that we had a panel on digital competencies, digital literacy necessary for modern languages. So I guess my next question would be how these sort of methods, you talked about moving from close to reading to distant reading and back again. So I guess the question is, on the one hand, what kind of analytical skills are necessary in order to be able to achieve that, to go back and forth, to be able to deal with two very different kinds of ways of engaging with material, and therefore how that changes the nature of research, whether it be scholarly or in a broader.
Yeah, I'll go back to my answer this morning, and I'll say that the most important skill in the digital age is not a digital skill, it's a human skill, it's collaboration. Because you cannot learn every single thing about every single field that you need to do. These are many of the types of things that you need to do. So it's programming useful? Yes. Can I learn to program? Yes, I did at some point. Can my PhD student be a much better programmer than I am? Yeah. Already. I mean, no discussion, because I need so many years of practice to become as skillful as they are that I wouldn't even use the name. I see my PhD students or any collaborators, the university or in other universities that I work with. So what I try to do is to collaborate with people who are able to do things or know things better than I do, and bring to the table what I'm good at, and in a way which attract them because they want to work in that type of problem. And the second thing that I would say, along with collaboration, is that the most important thing always is, what's the question? What's your question, your research question? It's not what the tool is. The tool is the means to solve the problem. If I can solve this by just underlining words, I'll do it. If I have to, I don't know, throw them into the Thames and they will come back analyzed, I'll throw them into the Thames. I don't really care. So the important thing always is, what's the intellectual question, the cultural question that you're going to solve.
Cool. Just to pursue that a little bit further, though, if you come into a collaboration where you're working with other people who have other skills that you don't have, you still have to learn about the skills they bring. You still have to have understanding of the new kinds of analysis that they bring. So for somebody who is about to launch into that or thinking of launching into that, what advice would you give them? And how do you, because you can only do so many things in a day, right? So how do you get in contact with distant reading without losing the core of what you already do, for example?
Again, going back to human skills, the thing that I learned, I think it was the most important thing that I learned very fast, is learn to listen to my colleagues. I would start like almost 15 years ago working with a mathematician, and I don't know what he was talking about, and he wasn't able to figure out what I was talking about, and we were talking Spanish, both of us, and it took some time to realize that we, in many cases, we were talking about the same things with different languages because of the history of the different disciplines. My background is in philosophy in this case. His was in mathematics, still is, and we came to a common ground when we started talking about complexity and complex systems. And he asked me, do you mean the same thing that I mean? And I asked him, what do you mean by complexity? It was a very absurd kind of discussion at the beginning. But what I didn't try to do ever was to try to diminish what he brought to the table, because I didn't understand it so that I would feel safe. I think that was the most important thing. I think it's a process of listening and communicating and insisting on, I don't understand it. I'm not able to create a mathematical model for the things that we do, but I understand what we are doing and why we are doing it and why this is relevant to solve the problem that we have.
So I guess my last comment or question would be hijacking the final question you had there. Do languages matter? I would say, do foreign languages matter? Do modern languages matter in cultural and social analytics? I see a lot of evidence of their use in the English language or in monolingual settings, but how can we use them to study modern languages in kind of foreign modern language sense, and equally, how can we reverse that, and how can we bring in modern foreign language perspectives into the analytic method?
In terms of language, they are so important because some of the things that you can do are language agnostic, but many other are not. And for instance, we wrote a couple of years ago an article for a colleague in Australia about sentiment analysis in Calderon Place. And the only dictionaries available in natural language toolkit and other tools available for Python and other programming languages were in English and in contemporary English. So analyzing 17th century Spanish with Twitter-based contemporary English was like not much. Yeah. So in that sense, we are in many of the languages, at least in Spanish, we are very behind in developing the tools that we need to apply these tools in a correct way in those settings. In general terms, the idea of foreign languages, as we were talking this morning, should be more relevant in the age of communication. That's what we do. Teach how to communicate, and think we should keep that in mind, that what we do is teach people how to better communicate, in this case across cultural borders, which are not going to disappear no matter what, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions?
Can I ask one about, I'm very taken by your example of building peace and what building peace might mean. And it first of all put me in mind of one of my old tutors who said sloppy language implies sloppy thought. And then I looked up as you were speaking, and I'm sorry not to have paid attention to what you were saying immediately afterwards. But I looked up translation equivalents for building peace in linguistic, which is, as you probably know, a parallel corpus translators database, and found that the Spanish equivalents of it were either construir, to build, consolidar, to consolidate, or fomentar, to encourage. So looking at those three Spanish terms might just give a bit more accuracy. And I was wondering, first substantive question is really, what those original Spanish words are. But the more general question I wanted to ask you really is, does language matter? Or is it that language matters too much? Is the form what is being pursued here? Something that sounds nice and positive, building, very constructive, peace, and does that hide any message that might have been behind it? Or do you believe that there is an actual message there which is failing to get out because of the way in which it's been linguistically encoded?
Yeah, very relevant both questions. The translations are those, and some of the work I did initially was to track appearances of home or something like that. I mean, you're talking about homeland, the nation, but they don't talk about building anything. So they're building peace. But peace is building what? Or I mean, is just the transitive into something else, or it dies out into its own building? It's very curious how limited, at least Spanish, is to relate to peace. And at some point, I also thought that all these negotiating people were from the School of Engineers, because in Spanish, at some point, I don't know if it's still the case, Fomento was the name of the Ministry of Public Works. So it's fostering as well, as you know, but at the same time, it's the Ministry of Public Works. Maybe I was looking for something more poetic into all this. I think that you're pointed at something which is very important, and the more data sets I analyze, big data sets from digital media, either YouTube, Twitter, different contexts, the more we realize that we're getting into a world in which only the tags matter. So there is a very difficult process of translation of something as complex as an agreement like this into a few expressions that you can sell or translate into not into what we used to call the main media, but Twitter, Facebook, and what we are exposed to as our main channels of communication. And I think that's also a problem in this process. Even more so, taking into account that the full government of a country goes behind the agreement, and they are not able to win the plebiscite. So the translation into okay, this is what we are trying to do, and this is how we're going to sell it to the public through a few of these metaphors of images. It's very clear it was a total failure. And then there is the temporality, or what maybe you would call the memory of language in this process, which is when this generation disappears from the scene, which is already happening. New people are becoming the judges, the politicians, the leaders of the different social groups. You have to go back to the text to interpret and solve the problems that will come up, already are coming up, or they will come up in a few years. And then the language is all you have. You can say now that the context was so important that everybody knew what they were talking about. But in 2 years, even now, all you have is language, as good as or bad as that language is. It was here, someone going first.
I think it helps with recording. Sorry, it's stood up. Thank you.
When you talked about the cards in which people were describing an event of peace,
Yes.
and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the disjunction between the language of peace that was used in this kind of like public negotiation process and the more kind of like private community language that people were using in answering those cards. If you have any thoughts about that notion of like, is there any sense of an imagined community that I came across in those engagements with peace beyond the personal?
Okay, I'll explain a little bit of the background. Is that the people running the cultural institutions of the bank were very fed up that the history of Colombia was a history of violent acts. I think the closer that we have in the last few years is the summary of Colombia that Narcos, the series from Netflix, paints of the country. Colombia is Narcos. And I think it's a very good series. I hope there are Colombian guys here, because Colombians are so fed up with that series, with the portray and the elevation of Miguel Escobar as a modern hero or something like that. So what they wanted to get is a different chronology of the country, something in which, okay, we have already also done very good things in historical terms, and we also want to know what people consider that are important events in the history of the country, not only negative. I think the most salient conclusion from that set of cards is that the space of peace is, I wouldn't say very small, it's very close to your physical presence, to your physical being, both in terms of the language you use, in terms of the things you refer to, the family, the space. It was always very close. And I relate that to what Antanas Mocus, the former mayor of Bogota, says about what's the main problem we have in Colombia. The main problem we have is a problem of trust. And that's a problem that we are seeing percolating now through many of our societies, in the Brexit, in the Trump election, in everything going on. we don't trust each other anymore. In Colombia, gets to the point that, in mathematical terms, because Mocus is a mathematician, he defines trust as the probability of the person coming across you, walking on the street, to assault you. So when you get to that level of distrust about your immediacy, I guess that the only thing that you really trust a little bit, and not much, because in many cases there are a lot of in-family violence in those descriptions, is it's very, very small. But you can see the scale of the problems. Not even the street, which is something that normally we take for granted here, at least until the dark sets at night in most places. You cannot count on that. I have a good friend that always, a woman, good friend in Bogota, who always says to me, so you are so lucky when you go to Madrid, or she's so happy when she's in Madrid because she doesn't feel the fear of walking on the streets. I guess when you lose that, what the system of transitional justice is, it's completely irrelevant to your daily life and how you survive. I don't know if thank you.
Thank you very much for that fascinating presentation. I'm not sure if I have questions so much as a comment. I'm from Belfast, so obviously I'm thinking of the Belfast Agreement all the time that you're talking about the Colombian peace agreement, and I have to say, depressingly, that everything you have flagged, I think, has been borne out in the 18 years since the Belfast Agreement in Northern Ireland. I think that for example, a deliberate vagueness about semantics at certain periods in the negotiation process, the discovery by international politicians of Seamus Heaney and other Irish poets, and how easily lines like hope and history rhyme, slip off the tongue. There's two ways of looking at that. At the time, it seemed very helpful, very important that people be able to make an imaginative leap, that poetic language was a helpful tool in doing that and being able to imagine a future. But I'm not so sure it has served us well for all the reasons that you're pointing out. I think that the emphasis on transitional justice that you talk about also happened in Northern Ireland to the detriment of having victims as being central to the process. But I think the main reason for that was an attempt to avoid competing victimhoods in a society that is profoundly polarized between two communities. And ironically, that phenomenon of competing victimhoods has been enshrined in other language that emerged from the process, like parity of esteem, which has become quite problematic in its own ways, particularly culturally. And finally, I think there's something that's beginning to emerge now in Northern Irish politics, which is a kind of historical revisionism, a rewriting of the years of conflict and the peace process by certain parties, which I suspect is also being facilitated by a semantic vagueness in the agreement itself. So I don't know if you've any comment. I'd love to know what you think of that context.
Thinking in terms of our responsibility, unless this morning discussion and this project is only metaphoric, I have been wondering for the last few weeks, few months, is how would I intervene in such a situation, being an expert on language? How did you, and what are the vehicles to develop a new language beyond your own home and family in a societal structure and level? And I'm not sure that's very easy these days because, especially young people, but all of us are exposed to media which is not even controlled by the governments anymore. And that represents most of the interactions that we have at a group level, at least. I'm not saying that we don't have personal interactions anymore, we do have them, but those group level types of institutions are not even national institutions anymore. And they are basically interested with time, attention, and entertainment. And that helps you forget things, but they don't go away. So that's one of the things that in very practical terms, and I say it's Ireland, Northern Ireland is Colombia, but I just received an analysis done by a colleague from UBIC in Canada for the people who are working on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission there with indigenous people. And I read the amount of processes of transitional justice that there have been or they're still going on in the world today, and I was appalled. I mean, I have read some of those things in the newspaper in the last few years, but there are over 50 processes. And you say, okay, how is this happening? What happened all along with us? And can we develop the skills and the tools to solve those problems? In some of the other professions, they have been able to do some things. For instance, there are people working in forensics and law who have created, it's not an NGO, but something similar, international, called Justice Rapid Response. And they have a trained group of experts all around the world who are deployed in places of conflict almost immediately after something happens, so they can collect the evidence, so that if at some point there's an international tribunal, they will be able to show that as evidence. So I wonder what is it that we do in cultural linguistic terms. We always ask ourselves, what's the use, what's the utility of our disciplines beyond teaching our students to learn another language, which is very important. But the question in this context of the digital age, can we deploy our tools in different contexts which are very much needed and say, okay, if you use this language, this is not going anywhere. Can we create the tools and the devices to do things in a different way? I also think in terms of any conflict that the most important thing is that you keep not the revisions, but the interpretations of the language that the victims use constantly open until those interpretations go away. And I see that as a set of moments in which the language of the very victims will change as a result of that interaction with society and with other interpretations. And that transition will also mark the way in which the victims at some point, if they choose so, they will stop being victims. But that's different from going back to the first version of the conflict and the victims that we got at the end of the conflict or the process. Because if you're still interpreting and using the same language as a point of reference, no matter how good it is, you are going back to the same interpretation, to the same imagined community, to the same future, to the same world. So facilitating that evolution of the language, I think it's key to really make the conflict go away as time progresses.
Hello. I've got two questions, one methodological and the other one more sociolinguistic. So the methodological one is, you mentioned that victims, it's below 1% of frequency. However, my question is it frequency or is it keenness? Because frequency
or?
Keenness, the key words. Because we know that the most frequent words are articles, prepositions, very common verbs or nouns. Therefore, even being around 1% could be quite significant. So that's my question, whether they were really keywords or just mere frequency. And the sociolinguistic question is, we keep repeating and listening, victims, victims. Is it clear-cut? You know, any internal conflict, it's got two sides. Are there victims on both sides? Do they identify both groups with their victims? Are they victims and, let's say, the other part, the opposite part? How is it reflected in your papers or in the language? Thank you.
Okay, the first question, the answer is it's frequency, but the norm in all this analysis using natural language processing is that you eliminate what they are called stop words. Yeah, that's normal. Unless you are looking for something very specific, you get rid of all of them because we assume that they don't have semantic content per se. That's, I don't know if it's valid or not, but that's the method. The second question is, in Colombia, there are not two parties. There are many parties. There are many parties. You have two negotiating parties, the main guerrilla group and the government. But you still have the ELN active, you have many forms of paramilitarism, you have the EPL is still active as well. So there are many different groups. And most of the victims probably don't identify with any of the groups, because in many cases, the truth is that you get raped by the paramilitaries, by the militaries, by the FARC, but everyone that passes through your land until you leave the land. And your kids have been kidnapped to serve in the different armies because you happen to be in a region controlled by this or the other. So most of the victims, I think that what they want is just to live their lives in peace, and in some cases, if possible, to go back to their lands, which is very difficult because there's no legal registry of lands in Colombia that everybody accepts. So the attempt to go beyond the legal definition of victims or the clear-cut definition of victims, I think sort of backfire, because they get this list of women, children, raizales, Afro-Colombianos, black. You say, okay, who is not a victim here? And probably it's true that in every single of those groups and many more, there are victims. But if the whole country is a victim, then what do you do? Yes.
I was wondering if the language used has been framing this as a Colombian conflict exclusively, because as you may know, Ecuador has also been affected with 3 journalists killed less than 2 months ago.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I was wondering if the language used to talk about the conflict has been framed as Colombian conflict exclusively, because Ecuador has also been affected. 3 journalists were killed less than 2 months ago.
In the documents that we analyzed and presented here, everything is related to Colombia. We have been following the electoral campaign through Twitter, and the kidnapping and the killing of the journalists by the faction of the FARC, or whatever they are now, in the Colombian border, came up as a very important topic for a few days, not a long period of time, because the topics in Twitter don't last that long. But it was very relevant. I think it was in March that happened. Whether that created a debate or expanded or helped frame the language in a different way, I don't think so. Because the bases are the same, and the politicians were basically using the language to throw it into the face of the opponents, and not to really explain any of the issues or explain how they would solve the situation if they were, at that moment, the presidents of the republic.
Any other final questions?
Getting silent exercise.
Sorry.
My question, but the question you asked, Juan Luis, does language matter? Or as Chris said, maybe languages matter too much. And then, your comment about all you have is language. And then just bringing back together these questions, because the heart of language acts and word making. How do we create the vehicles to develop the new languages that we might use in to be repetitive in the world? Because this is what we're doing, and it's really striking to me how difficult we find it in the discipline of modern languages or humanities to articulate those responses, if we have any, and this is what we're trying to do. And I would love to hear from other people, and for them to really respond to these questions during the conference. But I would like to hear if you have anything else to say about that, because it's so crucial. That question, does language even matter anymore, is so worrying. And we see it all around us. That's what we see. So.
Yeah. I don't know if I have the answer to that. but I would be very keen to exploring that through a workshop or a set of workshops in which people, experts in the field, would develop the tools and the programs to solve problems like this. On Friday, I have to give a similar lecture to a group of people in a conference. It's legal experts mainly related to transitional justice, and they're trying to figure out ways of setting up transitional justice tools before the agreements are signed, before the negotiations, to make sure that the agreements are really implemented later on. And I'm going to talk about language. And in this case, the context I'm going to talk about is language and artificial intelligence, because this type of analysis is so easy these days that people could at least check if what they are talking about is what they think they are talking about. And I wonder why they didn't do it. But I know, because of other partnerships that I'm engaged into at different levels from industry, so I don't think that industry is much more advanced in this than model languages departments. The government, they are not using these tools to check agreements, documents, policy briefs, all those things that most of our institutional architecture is based upon. So I think that we have an important role to play if we play it now. So in terms of an ideal scenario, let's say that tomorrow you get a call from Antonio Guterres, this General Secretary of the United Nations, and they commission you to solve the problem of language in Colombia. How would you do that? Because that's the real problem. It's not teaching the subjunctive, sorry. Teaching the subjunctive is a problem, but it's a different scale of problems. I think that we should embrace our knowledge and our ability to develop these programs as a mission that we have for the future of our disciplines and the impact that we can have in the world.
Thank you. I went to a design museum recently, and there was a very interesting exhibition, Hope for Nope. It's about involvement of social media and art in politics, and how it can be used and misused and transformed. And one of the posters said, slogans in nice typefaces won't save the human races. And my question to you is, in face of what was said about the Northern Ireland and recent events in North Korea, so we see the pattern of repetitive behaviors and application of language. Do you believe this is what you just presented, the language of peace or the language of peace propaganda?
This is the language of peace because these are the legal documents that will regulate the life of so many peoples in the next few years in Colombia. For anyone who had studied law, like myself, although I abandoned it in time, those are the things that really affect so many things, from contracts to whether or not you are considered a victim, you get the money or not that you need to repair your life. It's basically the conduit that we have, the only tool that we have to get people back into citizenship, into being Sangwan. The North Korea thing, my impression is that it's pure bad propaganda. Not even to the heights of Baroque propaganda and theater. But the devices they're using are so poor that you can see. I mean, it's the first time in diplomatic history that they get an agreement in which there is no agreement. So, but for a few days, it will be useful for the participants and will push the Republicans into midterm elections, and probably for the re-election of Trump, which now will be cherished as a great statesperson. I go back to Donald Davidson's theory of language, and going back to the basics of any theory of language is a theory of truth and a theory of meaning. And if you don't have those two things, Maybe it's not language, it's just propaganda.
Thank you. I was just here thinking and wondering, why do people or researchers, or I can say politicians, fail or fear to call the things by their name? I was just thinking about the issue of calling this conflict by its name, that is armed war or civil war. Because I think if we connect to the use of language, if we don't call these conflicts by their name, we will not raise the awareness of their danger and of the effects, the negative effects they cause. Because if you go around here looking for another name to soften the conflict itself, it might not have in the next generation the impact it had. We will find that people say it was just something small, because we found a name that is, I can say, fake for the real situation. So I don't know, on your own view, is it because of political or social reasons that they have to soften the names and find difficulty in calling that it was a civil war or it was armed war? Thank you.
I think that the reasons are mainly legal, have to do with the juridical status that you get into when you define something as a war. First, if you are the government, you recognize that you don't control the country, which no government can accept. Second, you are open to foreign intervention in the country. And third, the rules of engagement when you have a military encounter of any kind completely change, and they are adapted to international law of war, when and how you can engage the enemy and the consequences of that. If we were to think in terms of our own world, even if it's not language, I think the best sign of hinting at somewhere having a war is when you deploy your own army into your own territory, as opposed to the police. Except for emergencies like a hurricane or something like that, in which the army is helping people. But in that respect, I mean, if you see the situation in Mexico, in which the army has been deployed since the Calderon term in office, how do you define that? Also, I think there is an important linguistic question, which is when all these things are evolving as they are evolving these days, out of the normal political boundaries that we have conceived the world into in the second part of the 20th century, we're also again in the need of developing words that really mean what we're trying to describe. It's clear, for instance, that whatever is happening in Colombia is not the same of the Second World War. But it's not a war. Oops, a gentleman in the middle.
Thank you. I hesitated to intervene because I'm not really sure that have a real question. But it's to come back to a couple of points that's been made and was a motif which threaded its way in and out of your paper, and that is that we can talk about language in the abstract, what words to use, what are the meaning of particular words. But as I think one of the previous questions pointed out, it's the medium, it's the form, the material means of communication, which also have tremendous impact upon shaping the world. So, for example, if you to think of one of the most transformative changes in political medium in recent years, it must be Donald Trump's use of Twitter, which actually has the effect of voiding truth or meaning of anything. So as we are researching about the ways in which language acts in the world, we can never, ever forget how now and historically language has always been channeled through a particular material means of communication. So it's access to and control of those means of communication, which also have to be part of the equation that we're trying to deal with.
Totally agree.
So I had a sort of a question. You touched on this briefly, but I was interested if you could say a little bit more about the process of drafting these peace agreements. Who are the actors involved, and what's the process of drafting, redrafting, rewriting? And the second part would be, well, once an agreement is in place, then the logic would be to create some sort of, or to begin thinking of transferring an agreement into laws. And of course, that is a perpetual, I mean, you just listed a bunch of victims and agents in society. And so how feasible is it to create laws that would create reparations for all these victims, or even attempt to do justice, even at the sort of linguistic, legal level? I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on that?
In political terms, these are very complex processes in which apparently the communication is about to break down at any minute. And in this case, the two parties were accompanied by supervising partners, I think they call them, which were Norway, Cuba, and Venezuela and Chile. But as we learn more about the process, in many cases there are the people it was very tight control, especially at least what we know about the government party. Negotiating, they spent a lot of time in Havana without both parties, without seeing the families for weeks. But at some point, the president would circumvent his own negotiating team because he needed, at the end of the process, the agreement to be signed. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to approve it before he finished the term, and that would have been a disaster, and he wouldn't have gotten the Nobel Prize. So at some point, he sent other people to negotiate with the FARC to Havana because they were not able to move out to certain points that the negotiators thought that either it's this way or there's no way because of legal and political repercussions of whatever they did. And some of the images that we have in the negotiation is that they would sit down and read and write and rewrite the language in groups of sometimes 2 people, in other cases, group of 5, 7 people. What I think it was missing, and probably it's very difficult to implement because you need the agreement. What you need is the signature as the sign of, okay, we're going to stop killing each other. There wasn't a supervising entity taking care of just the flow of the language. Like what we said 3 years ago in the first part of the agreement is the same thing that we mean today when we use the same words. That never happened. I think that the people say that the best implemented part of the agreement is the part negotiated by the army with the generals from the guerrilla, because it was very technical, and there have been protocols in other parts of the world, which, okay, how we're going to disarm, how we're going to clean up the fields from mines and all the technical parts, because of the experience that the military bodies have all around the world. In terms of how difficult in such a polarized country implementing the agreement into law is, the law is supposed to be, the agreement is supposed to be law by itself, but then it got reviewed by the Constitutional Court to see if it passed the filter of constitutionality. And then the parliament, which wasn't totally controlled by the president, picked it apart. In a system in which most of the things are negotiated in the daily business of politics by the government giving money to the MPs to do something in their constituencies or for something that they have interest. So do you want this part of the agreement passed into law? What are you giving to me? But this happens at the end of the term and in an economic crisis, so the government doesn't have much money to do anything. And they start putting hurdles into it. The same thing with the rural reform. They didn't do much because they didn't have the money or didn't have the capacity. So just to give you an example, one of the most exciting things is that the agreement recognized that at least in the first election, which is the one that happened for Parliament in March, the victims would have, I think it was 10 seats in Congress. In principle, it's a very nice thing to have. They don't belong to any particular party. You recognize them as part of the political body of the country. They killed that. Time after time after time. The government tried everything, even some things which were completely illegal. They went to small courts in part of Bogota to have a judge approve the law. They have a discussion, it was completely surreal, a discussion about what half of the parliament means in mathematical terms, because you needed half of the parliament to approve that part in order to be enacted. And some of the parliament of the MPs had been sent to jail in the last 2 weeks. So there was a philosophical discussion as to whether or not those two guys were still members of parliament, and you would have to count 114 or 112. Because if it's only 112, we have 51. But it's 51 they have the half of 112, and lawyers and judges and politicians discussing this for months. And at the end of the day, they took it down. Although they kept in the books the 5 seats that the FARC, without going to elections, will have in the next parliament. Victims? So that's the situation.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Okay, well, that is, thank you very much again for a lovely... Thank you.